The morning sun was just coming up when the young man looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. He adjusted his collar for the third time, trying to get it just right. Today was his first day at a brand new school, and he wanted to make a good impression. His mother had already called up the stairs twice, telling him breakfast was getting cold. But he needed another minute. Just one more minute to convince himself that everything was going to be okay. He was 16 years old, a junior in high school, and until 3 weeks ago, he had never lived anywhere except the city where he was born. That city was loud and busy and full of people who looked like him. His old school had been diverse, a mix of every background you could imagine. He had friends there. He had a routine. He knew which hallways to avoid and which teachers would let you slide if you were a few minutes late. He knew where he belonged, but then his mother got the promotion she had been working toward for years. It meant more money, better hours, and a chance to finally buy a house instead of renting an apartment. The only catch was that they had to move 400 miles away to a small suburban town he had never even heard of before. His grandmother had hugged him tight the night before they left. She was staying behind because her whole life was in that city. Her church, her friends, the corner store where everyone knew her name. She held his face in her hands and looked at him with those wise old eyes that had seen so much. "You remember something," she told him. "You belong wherever you choose to stand. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't have a right to be somewhere. You hold your head up and you walk like you own the place. Because you do. You own every room you walk into." He thought about those words now as he stared at his reflection. He was tall for his age, with broad shoulders that made him look older than 16. His skin was dark brown, smooth and clear. His hair was freshly cut, lined up perfectly at the edges. He looked good. He knew he looked good. But looking good and feeling confident were two very different things. His mother appeared in the doorway, her car keys already in her hand. She was dressed for her new job, a sharp blazer and pressed pants. She looked excited and nervous at the same time, which was exactly how he felt. "You ready?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Yeah, I'm ready." The drive to the school took about 15 minutes. They passed through quiet streets lined with big houses and perfect lawns. Everything looked clean and orderly, almost like a movie set. He didn't see many people walking around. Nothing like the busy sidewalks back home. When they pulled into the school parking lot, his stomach tightened. The building was huge, all red brick and tall windows. Students were streaming in through the front doors, laughing and talking with their friends. He watched them for a moment, trying to read the situation. Most of them were white. Actually, from what he could see, almost all of them were white. His mother noticed him hesitating. "You're going to be fine," she said, squeezing his hand. "Just be yourself. That's all you ever have to do." He nodded, grabbed his backpack, and stepped out of the car. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves. He walked toward the entrance, keeping his pace steady and his head held high. Just like his grandmother taught him, the inside of the school was even more overwhelming than the outside. The hallways stretched in every direction, filled with students who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. He clutched the paper with his locker combination and class schedule. Feeling very much like a fish out of water, he found his locker after about 10 minutes of wandering. It was on the second floor, near the science labs. As he worked the combination, he could feel eyes on him. Quick glances from students passing by. Some looked curious. Others looked surprised, like they weren't sure what to make of him. A few just stared openly before whispering to their friends. He pretended not to notice. He focused on getting his locker open, which took 3 tries because his hands were slightly shaky. When it finally clicked open, he let out a small breath of relief. One small victory. His first class was English, and he found it without too much trouble. The teacher was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gray streaks in her hair. She welcomed him warmly and pointed him to an empty seat near the window. The other students watched as he walked to his desk, but no one said anything mean. A few even gave him small nods of acknowledgement. Maybe this won't be so bad. He thought by lunchtime he was starting to feel a tiny bit more comfortable. His classes had gone smoothly, and a couple of students had even introduced themselves. Nothing deep, just quick hellos and basic questions about where he was from. But it was something. He grabbed a tray in the cafeteria and loaded it with a sandwich, an apple, and a carton of milk. The room was loud and chaotic, filled with the clatter of trays and the buzz of conversation. He scanned the space, looking for an empty table where he could sit alone and observe. That was his plan for the first few days. Keep a low profile, figure out the social landscape, then slowly start to find his place. He spotted a table near the back corner. Mostly empty except for one kid reading a book. Perfect. He started walking toward it. That's when he heard the voice. "Hey, look who's here." The words were loud enough to cut through the noise of the cafeteria. He didn't stop walking, didn't turn around. Maybe it wasn't directed at him. Maybe someone else was being called out. "I'm talking to you, new kid." Now he had to stop. He turned slowly, keeping his face neutral. A senior was standing a few tables away, surrounded by a group of 4 or 5 other guys. They all had the same look, athletic builds, expensive clothes, the confidence that comes from knowing you're at the top of the social food chain. The one who had spoken was clearly the leader. He was tall with sandy brown hair and a smirk that looked like it had been permanently stuck to his face. "What's up?" the young man said, keeping his voice calm. The senior tilted his head, looking him up and down like he was examining something mildly interesting. "Just wondering what brings you to our school," the senior said. "Don't see many of your kind around here." The words hung in the air. "Your kind." The young man felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his composure. He had dealt with comments like this before, subtle jabs meant to remind him that he was different, that he didn't belong. But he refused to give this guy the satisfaction of seeing him react. "I was just moved here," he said simply. "Trying to get through the day like everyone else." The senior laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Get through the day? That's cute." He turned to his friends, who chuckled on cue. Then he looked back at the young man with cold eyes. "Well, enjoy your lunch, new kid. We'll be seeing a lot of each other." He walked away, his crew following behind him. The young man stood there for a moment, his tray growing heavy in his hands. Around him, the cafeteria had grown quieter. People were watching, waiting to see what he would do. He did nothing. He simply walked to the empty table, sat down, and started eating his sandwich. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his face showed nothing. He wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction. That night, when his mother asked how his first day went, he told her it was fine. He didn't mention the senior in the cafeteria. He didn't mention the way people stared or the whispers he caught at the edges of his hearing. She was so happy about her new job, so hopeful about their fresh start. He didn't want to worry her, but as he lay in bed that night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of his new room, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder. The senior's words echoed in his mind. "We'll be seeing a lot of each other." It sounded like a promise. Or maybe a threat. He thought about his grandmother, about her words of wisdom. "You belong wherever you choose to stand." He wanted to believe that. He really did. But right now, in this strange, new place where he stuck out like a sore thumb, belonging felt very far away. Still, he wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. Whatever came next, he would face it. That was the only choice he had. The first week passed slowly, each day feeling longer than the one before. The young man tried his best to stay invisible, moving through the hallways with his head down and his eyes focused straight ahead. He learned which routes to take between classes to avoid running into the senior and his crew. He figured out the timing of the cafeteria, arriving late enough that most people had already found their seats, but staying invisible in a place where you already stand out is nearly impossible. It started small. A shoulder bump in the hallway that felt a little too hard to be accidental. The first time it happened, he stumbled slightly but caught himself. He turned around to see the senior walking away, not even bothering to look back. His friends laughed quietly among themselves. The young man said nothing. He picked up the book that had fallen from his hand and kept walking. A few days later, it happened again, this time near his locker. He was putting away his history textbook when someone shoved him from behind. His face nearly hit the metal door. When he spun around, the senior was already 10 feet away, hands in his pockets, whistling like nothing had happened. "Watch where you're standing, new kid," he called over his shoulder. "You're always in the way." The young man's hands curled into fists at his sides. Every instinct told him to respond, to stand up for himself, to show this guy that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. But he knew better. He had seen what happened to kids who fought back against people like this. They got labeled as the problem. They got suspended. They got their futures messed up over one moment of anger. So he swallowed his pride and walked away. But the incidents kept coming. One morning, he found his locker smeared with something sticky, some kind of sports drink that had dried into a crusty mess overnight. He spent 15 minutes cleaning it before first period, his jaw tight with frustration. He never saw who did it, but he had a pretty good idea. In the cafeteria, the comments continued. Never loud enough for teachers to hear, but loud enough for him to catch every word. Comments about where he came from. Comments about how he dressed. Comments that made it very clear he wasn't welcome here. The worst part wasn't the words themselves. It was the way other students reacted. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. But nobody spoke up. Nobody told the senior to stop. They just watched. Like it was some kind of show happening on a stage they weren't part of. The young man started eating lunch in the library. It was quieter there, and the librarian didn't mind as long as he kept his food hidden and cleaned up after himself. He would sit in the back corner near the dusty section of encyclopedias that nobody ever touched and try to do his homework. But most of the time, he just stared at the pages without really seeing them. His grades started slipping. Not by a lot, but enough for him to notice. He had always been a strong student, the kind of kid who took pride in his report card. Back at his old school, he had been on track for honors classes. His teachers had talked about college scholarships, about all the doors that would open for him if he kept working hard. Now he could barely focus. Every time he sat down to study, his mind would drift to the hallways of this school, to the seniors' cold eyes, to the laughter of his friends. He felt tired all the time, even when he got enough sleep. A heaviness had settled into his chest that he couldn't shake. His mother noticed the change. Of course she did. Mothers always notice. One evening she found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a math worksheet he hadn't touched. "Talk to me," she said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Something's wrong." "I can feel it." He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to describe the shoulder bumps and the sticky locker and the whispered insults that followed him like shadows. He wanted to admit that he dreaded waking up every morning, that he counted down the hours until he could come back home and lock himself in his room. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. "I'm fine, Mom, just tired." "New school, you know? It's an adjustment." She studied his face for a long moment. He could tell she didn't believe him. But she also didn't push. Maybe she was too exhausted from her own new job. Maybe she wanted to trust that he would come to her when he was ready. Either way, she just nodded slowly and squeezed his hand. "If you ever need to talk," she said, "I'm here, always." He nodded back, forcing a small smile. "I know." That night he called his grandmother. Her voice on the phone was warm and familiar, like a blanket wrapping around him from 400 miles away. "How's my baby doing?" she asked. He almost broke down right then. Almost told her everything. But he held it together, keeping his voice steady. "I'm okay, Grandma. School is different, but I'm managing. Different how?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Just different. Smaller, quieter, not as many people who look like me." His grandmother was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but firm. "I know that's hard, baby. I know what it feels like to walk into a room and wonder if you're welcome there. But you remember what I told you. You belong wherever you choose to stand. Don't let anyone make you shrink yourself to fit into their small minds. You hear me?" "I hear you, Grandma." "Good, now you get some rest. And call me more often. I miss your voice." After he hung up, he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. His grandmother's words echoed in his head, mixing with the memory of the senior's sneer. Two voices pulling him in different directions. One telling him he was enough. The other trying to convince him he was nothing. 2 weeks turned into 3. The harassment continued, sometimes daily, sometimes with a few days of peace in between. Just enough time for him to let his guard down before the next incident hit, one Thursday afternoon. Everything came to a head. He was walking behind the gymnasium, taking the long route to avoid the main hallway where the senior usually hung out after school. The path was quiet, lined with tall bush and a chain-link fence that bordered the football field. He had his earbuds in, listening to music, trying to decompress after another exhausting day. He didn't hear them coming until it was too late. Suddenly, his earbuds were yanked out of his ears. He spun around and found himself face to face with the senior. But this time, the senior wasn't alone. 4 of his friends stood behind him, forming a loose semicircle that blocked any escape route. The young man's heart started pounding. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, every muscle in his body tensing up. But he kept his face calm. He wouldn't show fear. He refused to give them that satisfaction. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The senior stepped closer, so close that the young man could smell his cologne. It was expensive, probably something his parents bought him. Everything about this guy screamed privilege, the kind of kid who had never been told no in his entire life. "I want you to understand something," the senior said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is our school, our town. You don't belong here. You never will." The young man felt his back press against the cold brick wall of the gymnasium. He hadn't even realized he'd been backing up. The 4 friends moved closer, tightening the circle. "So why don't you do everyone a favor," the senior continued, "and go back to wherever you came from?" The words hit like a punch to the gut. Go back to where you came from. He had heard that phrase before, thrown at his grandmother when she was a young woman marching for civil rights. He had seen it spray-painted on walls in old photographs from history class. And now here it was, directed at him in the year 2024, behind a high school gymnasium. He wanted to fight. Every cell in his body screamed at him to push back, to defend himself, to show these guys that he wasn't some punching bag they could kick around whenever they felt like it, but he was outnumbered 5-1. And even if he somehow won this fight, he knew exactly what would happen next. He would be the one getting expelled. He would be the one with a record. They would twist the story until he was the villain. And these 5 guys were just innocent victims defending themselves. So he stood there, back against the wall, fists clenched at his sides, saying nothing. The senior shoved him once, hard. His head knocked against the brick. Stars exploded behind his eyes. "Nothing to say?" The senior taunted. "That's what I thought." And then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "That's enough." Everyone froze. Everyone turned toward the voice. The young man blinked, trying to clear the stars from his vision after his head had hit the brick wall. When his eyes focused, he saw 2 people standing about 20 feet away. The first was a girl. She looked younger than the senior, maybe a sophomore. She had the same sandy brown hair, the same sharp features. The resemblance was impossible to miss. She had to be related to him somehow. A sister, maybe. The second person was a man in his 50s. Tall and broad-shouldered with a military-style haircut that had gone mostly gray. He wore a school polo shirt with a whistle hanging around his neck. The young man recognized him from around campus. He was one of the coaches, the guy who ran the athletics program. The girl stepped forward first. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was strong. "I said that's enough," she repeated, looking directly at the senior. "What are you doing?" The senior's confident smirk faltered for just a second before he recovered. He let out a short laugh, the kind meant to make the other person feel stupid. "Mind your own business," he said. "This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me," the girl shot back. "You're my brother. Everything you do concerns me. And right now, you're acting like a complete jerk." The young man pressed against the wall, felt his eyebrows rise. Brother and sister? That explained the resemblance. But it didn't explain why she was standing up against her own family. The senior's face hardened. He took a step toward his sister, lowering his voice. "Go home," he said through clenched teeth. "We'll talk about this later." No, the girl didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere. I've watched you do this for weeks. Pushing him around, making comments, acting like you own this school and everyone in it. I kept quiet because I didn't want to cause drama. But this?" She gestured at the scene in front of her. 5 guys cornering one person behind the gym. "This is disgusting." The senior's friends shifted uncomfortably. One of them stuffed his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground. Another took a small step backward, like he was trying to distance himself from the situation. "You don't understand," the senior said, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain it to me." The girl shouted. "Explain why you think it's okay to treat another human being like this. Explain why you've turned into someone I don't even recognize anymore." The words hung in the air. For a moment, nobody moved. The young man watched the exchange, his heart still pounding, but his fear slowly being replaced by something else. Surprise, maybe, or hope. The coach finally stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who had seen enough conflict in his life to know that rushing only made things worse. He positioned himself between the two groups, his presence calm but commanding. "All right," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Everyone take a breath." He looked at the senior's friends first. "You 4. Walk away, now, go home, go to practice, I don't care. But you're done here." The friends didn't need to be told twice. They scattered like leaves in the wind, disappearing around the corner of the gymnasium without a single backward glance. Loyal until things got serious, then gone in an instant. Now it was just the 4 of them. The young man against the wall. The senior standing rigid with barely contained anger. The girl with her arms crossed and her jaw set. And the coach watching everything with sharp, knowing eyes. "Son," the coach said, turning to the senior, "I saw what happened. I saw you put your hands on this young man. I saw you shove him into that wall." The senior's face went pale. "Coach, I know exactly what you were doing." The coach's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen every kind of excuse, every kind of justification. Don't waste my time with yours." The senior closed his mouth. For the first time since the young man had met him, he looked small, uncertain, like a kid who had finally run into a wall. He couldn't push through. The coach turned to the young man. "You okay?" The young man nodded slowly. The back of his head throbbed where it had hit the brick, but he wasn't seriously hurt. "Just shaken. Good?" The coach looked back at the senior. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to report this to the principal. There will be consequences. But before any of that, I want to understand something." He stepped closer to the senior, studying his face like he was reading a book. "I've watched you for 2 years, the coach said. When you first came to this school, you were a different kid. Quieter, kinder, you worked hard in practice. You helped your teammates. Somewhere along the way, that kid disappeared. And I want to know why." The senior's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at some point in the distance. "It's none of your business," he muttered. "Maybe not," the coach agreed. "But I'm making it my business. Because I've seen too many young men go down dark roads because nobody bothered to ask them what was wrong. I spent 20 years in the Marines watching good people destroy themselves because they didn't know how to deal with their pain. I'm not going to watch it happen again if I can help it." The girl stepped forward, her expression softer now. The anger had faded, replaced by something that looked like sadness. "It's Mom," she said quietly. The senior's head snapped toward her. "Don't. He needs to understand," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She turned to the coach. "Our mom passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. It happened fast. Just a few months from diagnosis to ... She trailed off, swallowing hard. "He hasn't been the same since. None of us have. But he's taken it the hardest." The young man felt something shift inside his chest. He looked at the senior, really looked at him for the first time. Behind the anger and the cruelty, he saw something he recognized. Pain, deep, Unprocessed pain that had nowhere to go didn't excuse anything. Not the shoves, not the insults, not the weeks of torment, but it explained something. Hurt people hurt people. He had heard that saying before, but he had never seen it play out so clearly. The coach nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said to the senior. "Truly, losing a parent at your age is one of the hardest things a person can go through." He paused. "But grief is not a permission slip to harm others. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're going through, you don't have the right to take it out on someone who's done nothing to you." The senior's composure finally cracked. His eyes glistened and he blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears that had probably been building for 2 years. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just get so angry. All the time. And I don't know how to make it stop." The girl moved to her brother's side and put a hand on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to anchor him somehow. The coach took a deep breath. "Listen to me," he said. "What you're feeling isn't weakness. It's grief that never got dealt with properly. It turned into anger because that was easier to carry than sadness. But anger like that, if you don't address it, it'll eat you alive, and it'll destroy everyone around you in the process." He glanced at the young man, who was still standing quietly against the wall, taking everything in. "You owe this young man an apology," the coach continued. "A real one. Not today, maybe not even this week, but eventually. And more than that, you owe yourself some help. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want to call it. There's no shame in it. The bravest thing a man can do is admit when he's struggling and ask for support." The senior wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked broken in a way that was almost hard to watch. All that bravado, all that cruelty had been nothing but armor. And now the armor had fallen away, leaving just a sad, lost kid who missed his mom. The young man stepped away from the wall. His head still hurt. His heart still carried weeks of fear and frustration. But standing there, watching his tormentor fall apart, he didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel victory. He felt something closer to compassion. "I'm sorry about your mom," he said quietly. The senior looked at him, surprise flickering across his face. Of all the things he expected to hear, that clearly wasn't one of them. "I'm not saying what you did was okay," the young man continued. "It wasn't. But I know what loss feels like. And I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked. Life went on around them, oblivious to the weight of what was happening in this small space behind the gymnasium. The coach put a hand on the senior's shoulder. "Come on, son," he said gently. "Let's go talk to the principal. And then we're going to figure out how to get you some help." The senior nodded, defeated but somehow lighter. Like admitting the truth had lifted something off his back, Doc. As they walked away, the girl lingered for a moment. She looked at the young man with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what he did, for not speaking up sooner." "You spoke up when it mattered," he replied. She gave him a small, sad smile. Then she turned and followed her brother and the coach toward the main building. The young man stood there alone, the autumn wind picking up around him. His head throbbed. His emotions were tangled in knots he couldn't begin to untie, but for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than dread. He felt the faintest spark of hope. The next few days were strange. The senior wasn't at school. Word spread quickly through the hallways that he had been suspended, though nobody seemed to know the full story. Rumors flew around like birds, each one wilder than the last. Some said he got into a fight. Others said he was caught vandalizing property. A few whispered that he had finally gone too far and was facing expulsion. The young man heard all the gossip, but said nothing. He went to his classes, did his homework, ate his lunch. For the first time in weeks, he didn't have to look over his shoulder every 5 seconds. The knot in his stomach had loosened just a little bit, but he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened behind the gymnasium. The look on the senior's face when his armor cracked. The tears he had tried so hard to hide. The way his voice had broken when he admitted he didn't know how to make the anger stop. It was easier to hate someone when you didn't know their story. Now that he knew, everything felt more complicated. On the fourth day, the young man got called out of his history class. A hall monitor handed him a slip of paper with a room number on it. Conference room B, second floor. He had never been there before. When he arrived, he found a small room with a round table and several chairs arranged in a circle. The coach was already there, sitting with his arms crossed. The principal, a tall woman with silver-framed glasses, sat beside him. There was also a man the young man didn't recognize, someone in a button-down shirt with a calm, patient expression. And there, on the other side of the table, sat the senior. He looked different. Smaller somehow, even though his physical size hadn't changed. His eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He sat with his shoulders hunched forward, staring at the table in front of him. The young man hesitated at the door. "Come in," the principal said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please, have a seat." He walked in slowly and sat down. The chair felt hard beneath him. The room felt too quiet. The principal cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this might feel uncomfortable, but we wanted to try something different. This is what's called a restorative justice meeting. The goal isn't punishment alone. It's understanding, accountability, and hopefully healing." She gestured to the man in the button-down shirt. "This is our school counselor. He's trained in facilitating these kinds of conversations. He's going to guide us through this process." The counselor gave a small nod. "I want to be clear about something," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "Nobody is going to force anyone to speak. This is a safe space. What's said here stays here. The purpose is to give everyone a chance to be heard and to begin moving forward in a healthy way." The young man glanced at the senior, who still hadn't looked up from the table. The counselor continued. "We're going to start by letting each person share their experience, how they felt, what impact the situation had on them. Then we'll talk about what happens next." He turned to the young man. "Would you be willing to go first?" The young man's throat tightened. He hadn't expected to be put on the spot so quickly, but he nodded anyway. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He took a deep breath and tried to organize his thoughts. "When I first came to this school, I was nervous. I mean, that's normal, right? New place, new people. I didn't know anyone. I just wanted to fit in, find my classes, get through the day." He paused. "But from the very first week, I was targeted. Comments in the hallway. Getting shoved. My locker getting messed with. Every day, there was something new." He looked down at his hands. "I started dreading school. I would wake up in the morning and feel sick to my stomach just thinking about what might happen. I stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria because I didn't feel safe there. My grades dropped. I couldn't focus. I couldn't sleep." His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through. "The worst part wasn't even the physical stuff. It was the feeling that I didn't belong. That no matter what I did, I would always be an outsider here. That I was being punished just for existing." The room was silent. The senior still hadn't moved, but the young man noticed his hands were gripping the edge of the table. "I never did anything to deserve this," the young man continued. "I never said anything mean. I never bothered anyone. I just showed up and tried to live my life. And for some reason that was enough to make me a target." He finally looked directly at the senior. "I want to understand why. Because it doesn't make sense to me. What did I ever do to you?" The question hung in the air. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the senior lifted his head. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was tight with emotion. "Nothing," he said, his voice hoarse. "You didn't do anything." He rubbed his face with his hands like he was trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. "I know that doesn't help. I know it probably makes it worse. But it's the truth. You didn't do anything to me. I just—" He trailed off, searching for words. "I was angry. I've been angry for a long time. Ever since my mom died," he swallowed hard. "She was the one who held our family together. When she got sick, everything started falling apart. And when she was gone, I didn't know how to handle it. I felt like I was drowning all the time. And instead of dealing with it, I just pushed the pain down and let it turn into something ugly. He looked at the young man, really looked at him for the first time. You were new. You were different. You were an easy target. And I took all the anger I felt about losing my mom and I aimed it at you. Because it was easier than facing what was actually wrong with me. Tears slipped down his cheeks. He didn't bother wiping them away. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. What I did was wrong. It was cruel. And you didn't deserve any of it. The counselor leaned forward slightly. Thank you for sharing that, he said softly. It takes courage to be honest about our mistakes and the pain behind them. He turned to the young man. How do you feel hearing this? The young man sat with the question for a moment. His emotions were tangled up in ways he couldn't easily separate. There was still anger, still hurt. But there was also something else now. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding. I don't know, he admitted. Part of me is still angry. Part of me wants to hate you for what you put me through. He paused. But another part of me gets it. Not what you did, but why you were hurting. I lost my grandfather a few years ago. He raised me when my dad wasn't around. And when he died, I felt like a piece of me went with him. He took a shaky breath. I didn't turn that pain into hurting other people. But I understand what it's like to feel so broken that you don't know what to do with yourself. The senior nodded slowly, tears still streaming. I'm sorry, he said. I know those words don't fix anything, but I mean them. I'm really, truly sorry. The room went quiet again. The principal and the coach exchanged glances. The counselor made a small note on a pad of paper. This is a good start, the counselor said. A real start. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. But the fact that you're both here, both willing to listen and be honest, that matters more than you might realize. The principal spoke up. There will still be consequences, she said, looking at the senior. A 2-week suspension, mandatory counseling, and participation in our peer mediation program when you return. But we believe in second chances here. If you put in the work, you can come back from this. The senior nodded. I understand, she turned to the young man. And we want you to know that your safety is our priority. If you ever feel threatened or uncomfortable, you come to us immediately. We failed you before. We won't fail you again. He appreciated the words, even if he wasn't sure he fully believed them yet. Trust, like healing, would take time. As the meeting wrapped up, everyone stood. The senior lingered near the door, hesitating. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, he said to the young man. But I hope someday you can forgive me. Not for my sake, for yours. Carrying that kind of weight around, it'll eat you up inside. I know, because I've been carrying my own weight for 2 years. The young man studied him for a long moment. I'm not there yet, he said honestly. But maybe someday, the senior nodded, accepting the answer. That's more than I deserve. He walked out of the room, followed by the principal and the counselor. The coach hung back for a moment. You handled that well, he said to the young man. Better than most adults would. That takes real strength. It didn't feel like strength, the young man replied. Felt like I was just trying to survive. The coach smiled, a small but genuine expression. Sometimes that's the same thing. The weeks that followed were not easy. Nothing changed overnight. The young man still walked the hallways with a certain caution, still flinched slightly when someone moved too quickly behind him. Those instincts don't disappear just because a meeting went well. Trauma leaves marks that take time to fade, but slowly, things started to shift. The senior returned to school after his 2-week suspension. He was quieter now, keeping to himself most of the time. His old crew had scattered. Some of them avoided him completely, embarrassed by their own participation in something they now had to reckon with. Others tried to reconnect, but he kept his distance. He wasn't interested in going back to who he used to be. He attended counseling twice a week. At first, he hated it. Sitting in a room, talking about his feelings, digging up memories of his mother that he had buried so deep he almost forgot they existed. But his therapist was patient and kind, and after a few sessions, something started to crack open inside him. He began to understand that grief doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It waits, it festers, and eventually it finds a way out, often in the worst possible ways. He also joined the peer mediation program, just like the principal had required. At first he felt like a fraud. Who was he to help other students resolve conflicts when he had caused so much harm himself? But the advisor who ran the program saw something in him. "You know what it feels like to be the problem," she told him one afternoon. "That means you understand it from the inside. That gives you a perspective most people don't have. Use it." So he did. He listened to younger students who were struggling with arguments and misunderstandings. He helped them talk through their issues without letting things escalate. And every time he successfully guided a conversation toward peace instead of conflict, he felt a small piece of himself healing. Meanwhile, the young man was finding his own footing. With the shadow of fear lifted, he could finally focus on the things that mattered. His grades climbed back up. He started eating in the cafeteria again, sitting with a small group of classmates who had quietly admired his resilience from afar. They weren't close friends yet, but they were becoming something. A beginning. He called his grandmother more often now. She could hear the change in his voice, the lightness that hadn't been there before. "You sound like yourself again," she said one evening. "I feel like myself again," he admitted. "It took a while, but I think I'm okay. More than okay," she said proudly. "You walked through fire and came out standing. That's not just okay. That's extraordinary." The relationship between the two young men remained distant at first. They passed each other in the hallways without speaking, just a brief nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A mutual recognition that they had both been through something heavy and come out the other side. Then spring arrived, and with it came the annual school assembly. The principal announced that this year's theme would be about community, respect, and second chances. Several students would be invited to speak about their experiences. When the young man received an invitation to participate, he almost declined. Public speaking wasn't his thing, and talking about the worst period of his life in front of hundreds of people felt terrifying. But then he learned that the senior had also been invited to speak, and something about that changed his mind. If the guy who had tormented him was willing to stand up and tell the truth, then maybe he could too. The day of the assembly arrived. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and even some parents who had heard about the special program. The young man sat in the third row, his palms sweating. A few seats away, he spotted the senior's sister. She caught his eye and gave him a small, encouraging smile. The principal opened with a brief introduction about the importance of empathy and accountability. Then she invited the senior to the stage. He walked up slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the podium. For a moment he just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. Some were curious, some were skeptical. A few of his former friends smirked in the back row, waiting for him to embarrass himself, but he didn't run. He took a breath and began to speak. "Most of you know me," he said, his voice unsteady at first. "Or at least you think you do? You know, the guy who walked around like he owned this school. The guy who made jokes at other people's expense. The guy who hurt someone who never did anything to deserve it." He paused, steadying himself. "What you don't know is why. Not that it excuses anything, because it doesn't. But 2 years ago, I lost my mom. She was my best friend. And when she died, I didn't know how to handle it. I was angry all the time. At the world, at God, at myself for not being able to save her. And instead of getting help, I let that anger turn into cruelty." His voice cracked slightly. "I targeted someone because he was new, because he was different. Because hurting him made me feel powerful when everything else in my life felt completely out of control. I told myself he didn't matter. I told myself it wasn't a big deal, but it was a very big deal." He looked toward the third row, directly at the young man. "I caused real harm. I made someone afraid to come to school. I made him question whether he belonged here. And that's something I have to live with for the rest of my life." Tears streamed down his face now, but he kept going. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. That's not why I'm up here. I'm up here because I want everyone in this room to understand that your actions have consequences. The things you say, the things you do, they leave marks on people, sometimes marks that never fully go away. He wiped his eyes. If you're struggling with something, anything, please talk to someone. Don't do what I did. Don't let your pain become someone else's burden. It's not worth it. And you'll end up hurting yourself just as much as you hurt them. He stepped back from the podium, his chest heaving. The auditorium was completely silent. Then, slowly, someone started clapping, then another person. Then another. Soon, the room was filled with applause, not for the person he used to be, but for the courage it took to stand up and tell the truth. The principal returned to the microphone and invited the young man to speak next. His legs felt like jelly as he walked to the stage. His heart pounded so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. But when he reached the podium and looked out at the audience, something shifted. He saw faces that weren't judging him. They were listening. A few months ago, he began, I thought, I had made the worst mistake of my life by coming to this school. I felt invisible and targeted at the same time, like I didn't exist except when someone wanted to remind me that I didn't belong. He took a breath. But I learned something important. You can't control how people treat you. You can only control how you respond. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep showing up, even when every part of you wants to run away. He glanced at the senior, who was sitting off to the side of the stage with red-rimmed eyes. I also learned that people are complicated. The person who hurt me was also a person in pain. That doesn't make what he did okay, but it reminds me that we never really know what someone else is going through. And maybe if we took the time to understand each other, we wouldn't cause so much damage in the first place. He paused. My grandmother once told me that I belong wherever I choose to stand. For a while I forgot that. I let other people make me feel small, but not anymore. I'm standing here today because I refuse to let anyone take away my sense of belonging. This is my school too, and I'm not going anywhere. The applause that followed was thunderous. Students he had never spoken to were on their feet. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Even the skeptics in the back row seemed moved. As he stepped away from the podium, the senior stood up. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other. Then the senior extended his hand, the young man took it, and then, surprising even himself, he pulled the senior into a brief hug. It lasted only a second or two. But in that moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. A door cracked open that might one day lead to real healing. The auditorium erupted again. People cheered. Some cried. The principal watched with a quiet smile, knowing she had witnessed something rare and precious. Later that day, the young man called his grandmother. How did it go? She asked. He smiled, feeling lighter than he had in months. I stood up, Grandma, just like you taught me. And how did it feel? He thought about the question, about everything he had been through, about the fear and the pain and the slow, difficult climb back to himself. It felt like coming home.